Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hasquin, and here I am again with more things you should know by being alive. And today I want to talk about, well, this unforgettable face, those wild eyes. This is John Brown. We're going to get into Podawatami Creek and Harpers Ferry and, well, what John Brown's legacy was. So let's get to know the situation and the man a little bit better. So, chapter 1, right? So, what's America like before John Brown? So by the time the United States makes it into the 1850s, the nation was deeply divided over the question of slavery, and we have sectionalism taking place in antebellum America. The North increasingly opposes slavery, and the South depends on slavery for its economy, its culture, its way of life. The Missouri Compromise of 1820. Compromise of 1850, both of those things tried to ease the sectional tensions, and we end up with additional conflicts rising up with the Fugitive Slave Act, and then we had the publication of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, and between those last two things continue to grow as far as tension is concerned. Who's John Brown? Who's the man? He was born in 1800 in Connecticut. He was raised in Ohio in a very deeply religious and abolitionist family. Believed very strongly in the fact that slavery was a sin against God, and he was determined to end slavery, even by force, if it was necessary. John Brown moved around a bit. He lived in multiple states. He worked as a tanner, a farmer, a wool merchant, and he raised a large family as well. Now, enter into the national dialogue, the national conversation here, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I've done another video on the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, but if you haven't seen them, well, here we go. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed voters to vote on the issue of slavery in new territories through a process known as popular sovereignty. Basically, Congress kicking the can to the residents of the territory saying, you decide. So Kansas becomes a battleground. You got pro-slavery forces, the border ruffians who fled across the border from Missouri, and you have anti-slavery settlers, the free soilers who thought that land should be free of slavery. They move in to try and keep Kansas from becoming a slave state. And this leads to Bleeding Kansas. Widespread violence, two rival governments being set up, one in Lecompton for the slave issue, and the other one in Topeka for anti-slavery. Well, add to this mix John Brown arriving in Kansas. In 1855, John Brown and several of his sons moved to Kansas in order to support the free soil cause. He saw violence against anti-slavery settlers, and he couldn't stomach it, especially the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas by pro-slavery forces in May of 1856. Brown's had all he can stand, and he can't stand no more, and he decides that it's time to strike back. So, on May 24th and 25th of 1856, John Brown leads a raid near Podawatami Creek, and he and his followers pulled 5 pro-slavery men from their homes at night. They executed those men with broadswords in front of their families. And Brown believed that this would, 1, send a message to pro-slavery forces, and 2, defend free soilers from future attacks. But instead, the massacre horrifies many people, and it also paints John Brown with the brush of becoming, well, basically a symbol of militant abolitionism. So, we're just going to see an escalation in the violence when it comes to Kansas. After Potawatomi Creek, Kansas effectively becomes a war zone. Battles like the Battle of Osawatomie in August of 1856, where Brown and his followers eventually fight against pro-slavery forces again, and then you end up with a number of skirmishes, raids, reprisals, revenge begin taking place on both sides. Bleeding Kansas begins to preview the violence that's going to engulf the entire nation, especially with secession on the horizon. Now, Brown's ideology here, what made him so fervent? He believed that, slavery was America's original sin, and it needed to be rooted out. It needed to be cut out. Peaceful means would never bring slavery to an end. And he believed that he was chosen by God to end slavery. He saw the violence that was taking place in the name of anti-slavery forces as righteous. And Brown worked with Northern abolitionists. This was a group called the Secret Six, and he was able to secure funding for his future plans of abolition. Now, as a result, Brown is emboldened, and he develops a pretty radical plan. And he's like, you know what we can do? We can capture the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. By doing so, we can arm enslaved people. Once they're armed, it will lead to a wide-scale slave rebellion against the states in the South, against pro-slavery governments, forces, owners, everything. And they would then pull back into the Appalachians, and they would use that as a base of operations for continued raids against pro-slavery supporters. So, October 16th, 1859, John Brown and 21 men, including black and white abolitionists and some of John Brown's own sons, attack the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And initially, they captured the armory. They took hostages. They even took George Washington's great-grandnephew as a hostage here. But they get surrounded by local militia, and then the U.S. Marines, under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, storm the engine house on October 18th. And Brown is captured, he is wounded, and he is taken into custody. As a result of his actions, John Brown is charged with treason against the state of Virginia. He's charged with murder and also inciting a slave revolt. He is found guilty, and the sentence was death. And on December 2nd, 1859, John Brown was hanged. But before his execution, John Brown stated, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Of course, his words were prophetic. The reactions across the United States, well, let's start in the North. Many saw Brown as a martyr of freedom. They rang church bells on the day of his execution, celebrating his efforts and his martyrdom. In the South, the raid confirmed fears that Northern abolitionists would encourage slave revolts. And Brown's raid just deepened an overall mistrust in the South, and it increased calls for Southern secession to preserve slavery as an institution. John Brown's legacy, well, his actions, right? One, it showed how deeply divided America was over slavery. Another thing was it proved that peaceful compromise was just going to fail. It was a failing effort. And John Brown's actions also inspired abolitionists and radicalized others who realized slavery could only end through conflict. So John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry helped ignite the Civil War 16 months later. Why does John Brown matter? He's a complex figure. He's a terrorist to some. He's a freedom fighter to others. But he forced America to confront slavery's brutality and prove that one person's moral conviction can change history, even at a great cost. John Brown's story, from Bleeding Kansas to Harper's Ferry, is the story of a man who believed slavery was so evil that it had to be destroyed by any means necessary. His actions shocked the nation and helped push America toward a reckoning that became the Civil War. If you learned anything tonight, give me a like, a share, a follow, a comment, a question, and I'll give you more things you should know about being alive. Because understanding John Brown helps us see the lengths that people will go to fight injustice and the consequences when a nation ignores it for too long. Thanks for watching.